Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, August 18th, 2025, and our friend Carl Jacques Baud is back with us. Welcome back, Carl.
Thank you for inviting me again. Hi to everybody.
What a week we had, Carl. We had a meeting between the two presidents, the president of the United States and Vladimir Putin, and in the aftermath, during the talk, they did a lot of on the Russian part, they thought that it was positive. On the part of the United States, they feel that it was positive. The Trump administration believes that, and the media going totally against that rhetoric. And we've learned that European leaders are going to be in the United States talking with the president of the United States together with Zelensky, by the way. Guardian says that European leaders are in panic. And before coming up, you've mentioned that the Europeans were talking about that Russia and China are house of cards, which turns to be the situation that they're describing about these two countries. It turns to be about Europe itself. Your take on what has happened and what we are gonna face in the next step.
Well, definitely, the Europe demonstrates itself as a house of cards, and not Russia or China, who have demonstrated a remarkable stability. In fact, despite all the sanctions and all that. But the reason why the European elite or so-called elite are in panic is because now they realize and they can see, they witness that the whole narrative that we had in the last 3 years is crumbling completely. I mean, it's a triviality to say that Russian is winning on the battlefield, but what Europeans have realized is that they and even the US, in fact, has realized this, that regardless of what they want to achieve with any kind of agreement with Russia, they don't have the resources, the means, or whatever you may think about. They don't have all that in order to impose Russia a behavior. They don't have it anymore. They don't have the military power to do that. And they don't want to do that because that would lead into World War III, and nobody wants that. They don't have the capacity and the capability to help Ukraine militarily, both in terms of weaponry, in terms of education, military education, even in intelligence. They are outsmarted by the Russians today. So they don't have anything that may affect the behavior of Russia on the battlefield. The sanctions have proved totally ineffective for Russia, China, and others. I mean, Iran is a case in point, but for the sake of a discussion, Russia has demonstrated that sanctions are totally ineffective, and the reason is that since 2014, Russia managed to anticipate future sanctions, and so when those sanctions, those brutal and massive sanctions, were applied to Russia in 2022, Russia was prepared for that. They had one of the lowest foreign debt, and therefore it was very difficult to pressure Russia. Even the frozen assets or even confiscated assets for some of them are not able to constitute any kind of pressure on Russia. And in addition to that, the secondary sanctions, such as the one that were threatened to be used by Trump and, of course, Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal with this initiative, this possible bill by the Congress. These secondary sanctions are proved ineffective as well, because now the West and the US at large has created a situation in which the so-called rest of the world, has created a parallel market, if you want, meaning that they are less and less dependent on the US market. Doesn't mean that it's totally independent, right? But they are less and less dependent, meaning that there are alternatives. And we have seen that with the sanctions that the US threatened to use with the soybeans, for instance, against China. And China said, okay, fine, we just stop buying US soybeans and we buy them in Brazil. As a result, now the market for the US is dead. I mean, the Chinese market is dead, and and they will not send or sell soybeans to Brazil, because obviously Brazil can produce that at much cheaper price. The result of the whole this is that every single move that the US is doing creates a problem against the West or the US itself. So we are in what you call in a chess. It's a mat. I don't know in English how you say that, but it's a situation where you can't move anymore. Checkmate. Yes, checkmate. Thank you. If when you start to move, then you start to create a vulnerability for yourself. And in addition to that, slowly, we see, if you look at the narrative, or let's say the talks, better said, that you have in the media and even among politicians, especially in Europe, the idea that Ukraine will have to cede territories, this idea is accepted in essence, in a principle. Some people dream about having part of the Kherson, Zaporozhye region and things like this. There's some discussion around this, although Russians are in a position to stay firm on what they demanded, which is the totality of Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk, period. But anyway, the idea that Ukraine may have to cede territory is there, even with those who are radical supporters of Ukraine. The idea that Ukraine will not be member of NATO is there. And in fact, it's not new. This has been off the table since Biden. Already Biden said that there is no way Ukraine will be member of NATO. And in fact, we have kept Ukraine dangling on a string. And I don't know how Zelensky could believe that, because it was absolutely clear that Ukraine will not be member of NATO. And I remind you that in March 2022, Zelensky said to CNN that he asked Biden if Ukraine would be member of NATO, and he said the answer was no, Ukraine will not be member of NATO, but for the public, we'll keep the door open, meaning that the whole issue of NATO for Ukraine was in fact a PR issue, not a reality. Nobody had in mind that Ukraine would. Probably some European countries believed in that, but I think NATO is built around U.S. nuclear power. Therefore, the U.S. is the primus inter pares in NATO, and if U.S. opposes the membership of Ukraine, there is no question. And Biden said so, Trump said so, and it was repeated recently by even Big Headset and Marco Rubio that the Ukraine membership to NATO was off the table. Even if you had people like Keith Kellogg and so on who said that it's off the table for now, but it may be later and things like that, which is, by the way, this is the understanding the Russians have. And that's why they want a solid confirmation and a treaty that said explicitly that Ukraine will not be member of NATO. And that's the reason why Russia asked this, the official abandonment of this request by Ukraine to be part of the settlement that will lead to ceasefire and all that. So we understand that this is off the table result. As a result, all the fundamentals that have driven this conflict so far, in fact, have evaporated. NATO, the security guarantees are still on the table, but this is something we can talk about. But Russia has never been against that. But NATO as such, it will be out of the table. Probably EU will be off the table as well, since EU wants now to have its own defense policy. As a result, it has become, as Sergei Lavrov said in February 2023, EU has become a kind of small NATO. And therefore, we are no longer... So, and that's the result of the move of the European Union, because instead of playing the role of a mediator in that conflict, EU has become a party of the conflict. And we see that today with this delegation that originally should have been just with Zelensky visiting Trump, and today it has become a small delegation with several European head of state or officials, including Ursula von der Leyen, who want to go to Washington in order to support Zelensky. So, meaning that Europe, instead of being a mediator in this conflict, has become a party of the conflict. As a result, Russia has raised its demands, and probably European Union, the membership to European Union will be off the table as well. So all the situation has been more complex for Ukraine, and without now people understand and accept the idea that Ukraine is failing on the ground, that they don't have troops anymore, that they are lacking personnel. The forced recruitment has generated a huge opposition within Ukraine itself. I mean, all that converge towards the end of Ukraine, in fact. And that's why just after the meeting in Alaska, the Western countries, European countries are panicking, because they say that the whole policy they had in the last 3 years is totally collapsing. And interestingly enough, the Europeans have not been able to anticipate that, in a sense that, I think we have said that on your channel already, but the thing is that today, of course, Europe has no ties and diplomatic relations anymore with Russia. But also the relationship with China is not good. The relation with the BRICS is not good, meaning that Europe is alone facing the US now, and it has no allies. And that's where you see the total absence of strategic thinking in Europe, because they knew that Trump would get away from Ukraine. It was known since more than 1 year. Even before Trump was elected, he said that he would stop the support to Ukraine. They knew all that the Ukraine was failing, and so on and so forth. So meaning that today, just hanging on one narrative, Europe sees that there is no options anymore. It's failing, or it can do a 180 degrees turn and change completely its policy. But, it would have to sell that to its population, because the interesting thing is that when we talk about this changing attitude towards Russia, this was more or less in the spirit of electing Trump last November. The MAGA support to Trump was, I mean, it was composed by people who had wanted this focus on the US and no longer on useless and very expensive wars abroad. And in fact, we see that if we look at the spending on research and development in key technologies and future technologies, we see that US has lost a lot of ground as compared to China, for instance. The strengths of China, and the same for Russia as well, by the way, is that they didn't get involved in very expensive conflicts so far. I mean, I'm talking about Russia in particular. But so that means that in the past 10 years or so, both Russia and China were able to, for Russia to strengthen its own economy in order to anticipate future sanctions. But in China, it was not exactly the same pressure. It was more economic and commercial nature. But the same is that China could develop its own industry to make it. I mean, we have seen that with semiconductors. Today, China has developed new technologies that, in fact, don't need the European, the ISML, the Dutch technology anymore. I mean, probably not completely, but to a large extent, now they are independent on that issue. So meaning that making war and waging war against people has distracted a lot of resources from essential spendings in research, development, education, and infrastructure. Look at the US, it's a catastrophic infrastructure. So we see that this idea of focusing exclusively on Ukraine and especially from the European point of view, where you have this total focus despite a degrading discontent from the population. And you see in almost every country, the major country at least, like Germany, France, UK, those leaders are hated by their own population. Their popularity rating is extremely low for all of them. And in fact, they destroyed their whole economy for the sake of fighting Russia. So that adds to this equation that makes the European leaders extremely anxious about the result of a possible peace agreement. In addition to the fact that if the US decides, as it was said by Pete Hegseth in February this year, that this should be a sharing of a division of labor between US and Europe, that Europe should take care of the conflict with Ukraine and US will take care of the conflict with China, things like that, meaning that when it will come to the reconstruction of Ukraine, the Europeans will be alone.
But don't you think that was somehow childish? Because I would argue that one of the biggest winner of what's going on in Ukraine and in the Middle East is China, because China is getting some sort of leverage on those countries who are providing them with energy, and they're getting more discounted. It's just somehow they wanted to, if we assume that the final goal is China for the United States in the eyes of those people who are running the show, they're benefiting China by these sort of policies. Don't you think they helped China during the war, during this conflict?
Well, we have to understand the mechanics here. There was a huge debate already in 2020, 2021 in the US as to whether they should continue against Russia as a primary objective or against China as a primary objective. And there was a debate because obviously both countries, Russia and China, are considered as, let's say, a competitor in the best case or enemy in the worst case by the US. The problem is the Russia is more on the geopolitical or geostrategic ground, while China is more on the trade and economic ground. Now the question is which one you should tackle first. And this was this idea that first you should tackle Russia, so that if you weaken and even make Russia to collapse, and then it could not support China, and then China will have its backyard, will have a problem in its backyard, and will not have the support in terms of energy supply or things like that, and that will make China more vulnerable to US competition. That was one approach. The other approach was saying, well, Russia is not playing an important role anyway, so we should focus directly on China, because this is the most direct adversary we have, especially as a trade competitor, and therefore we should address China first. So there was those two ideas. And hence this whole concept of strategic sequencing, that at the end probably we should start with Russia and eventually go to China. And to some extent, that's the option that the Biden administration have chosen. And that's what somehow the Trump administration have also admitted, although they handle the problem differently. But in any case, what you say, it's true. At the end, those who have not been affected by the conflict or didn't want to be affected by the conflict are the winners. And when we say China, we could even extend the reasoning to the old BRICS, because if we look, I mean, the Ukrainian conflict has probably the most significant geopolitical impact since the last 50 years. Probably, I mean, the end of the Cold War was definitely something important. But let's say in the last 30 years or so, we have here the conflict in Ukraine had the most significant impact. And in this situation, you can see that I lost my reasoning. Sorry about that. But in all that, all the one who were not focused on that conflict, and namely the rest of the world that has been left aside for some reason, they could then focus on China, not focus on China, but let's say they could use China as the engine of a second track economy, if you want, on the planet. The Western, I mean, the Western economy and the Western world was driven by the US engine since the Second World War, in fact, and even before. And that has, in fact, powered the world for a while. But now the focus on this conflict in Ukraine has opened a window of opportunity for the rest of the world, if you want. And this opportunity has been supported by the fact that China could play the same role as the US did in the second part of the 20th century. But now it's China. It is the engine of the world somehow. It has, this is where the technological development happens. That's where you have the trade power, the production capacity, manufacturing capacity, and all that. And that's exactly what the advantage the US had in 1945. This power has faded, and now it's China. Now, because we all the sanctions we put on everybody and things like that, and probably all the sanctions we put on Russia, prompted this a more central role played by China. And that's exactly what we have seen. I mean, economically speaking, the world now, outside of the Western world, the world is centered on China.
Colonel,
And
can we say that China, with the behavior that we've seen from China so far, they didn't show any sort of imperialistic behavior toward other countries? Is that correct? From what we've seen so far from China?
well, my own experience, I lived 2 years in Sudan and 2 years in Kenya. Those two countries, at the time I was there, were the two, let's say, the countries in which China was the most present. And China was building this huge dam on the Nile River, and therefore had huge project there with thousands of workers, construction workers there. And when I was in Kenya, you had China was building the railroad between Nairobi and Mombasa, and were in fact renovating the whole road network and highway network around Nairobi. So China was very present on the ground, but when you were moving around, and in both cases, in both countries, I was in touch with the local authorities at different levels, especially higher level. But you never saw the Chinese. You see, they were here to do what they had to do. I mean, mostly construction works, and they did that. Once that was done, they went away, period. On the contrary, I used to work in Chad, for instance, or in Mali. Everywhere you had some French diplomat or military that was there hanging around, having an office in some ministry and things like that. You didn't see that in both in Kenya and in Sudan, meaning that the Chinese, they focused their activity on building infrastructure, and they didn't want to intervene in local, which is common sense, in fact, because they didn't need to have any physical presence in ministries and all that, because at the end, what is driving their presence is trade. Therefore, by building construction, by building infrastructure and renovating infrastructure and all that, they were just setting the ground for better trading cooperation or trading infrastructure. And that was the focus, period. Therefore, they didn't need to have a political influence there. And when you talk to African leaders and let's say mid-level leadership and things like this, they're very happy with that, because when the Chinese come to do something, they do not come with conditions. You see, they do their job, they are paid for that, and they go, period. They did what they had to do. And that, in fact, especially in Africa, creates more trust between people. And because having always some people, some white people there checking everything and making an argument with everything and making advice and all that is not something that creates trust, in fact. And I could see that in especially French Africa, that means Western Africa. Africans were, let's say, polite with the French, but when you talked with them, they were not happy with this situation because they felt wrong or right. They felt that they were still a colony somehow, and that was affecting their own national pride somehow, and therefore they felt that they had a distorted relationship. There was not peer to peer. You see, it was like the teacher and its pupil somehow. And that's a situation that you can accept somehow, but it may not be a situation you are happy with. And that's exactly the problem. With the Chinese, it's not the case. The Chinese, again, you have a contract type relationship, and that's it. Period. You pay for something, you receive something, and that's all. So what I've seen, I mean, in the last couple of years, I mean, during the whole Ukrainian conflict and the expansion of Chinese trade with China and probably South America, I don't know. But it's that the Chinese, they are just interested in trade, period. They are not interested in imposing some kind of political political ideology or things like that. And they have been very consistent for that. So by and large, I think the Chinese have a more respectful foreign policy towards the rest of the world. It's a more pragmatic policy. You see, the problem, and I'm sure the French at the very beginning in the 19th century, they had a more paternalist approach to colonialism. And they probably had the feeling that they would help the country they were colonizing. That's probably true at that time. I cannot judge that, but my feeling is that there was probably a genuine sense of willingness to help. The problem is that when they were there, and that's very clear, for instance, in Congo, where I spent some time in the mid-90s, the Belgian developed infrastructure and all that. But that's when they were there. Once they left, all that crumbled because they didn't create the necessary know-how to maintain that. They didn't provide the technical support to maintain that. So everything crumbled. And if you go in more French, not Belgian, but French Africa or former French Africa, the French didn't really build infrastructure and things like this. So that means that they didn't create a precondition for good and effective trade. While the Chinese have this approach to say, okay, we don't care about who is the politician, but we just want to create a structure that allows good and free trade as much as we can. So roads, so that the trucks can move, that you can bring your merchandise. I mean, no, it's not the right thing, but we bring our stuff, and you can move through rail or road, and you can sell that. And that's the idea, to create an infrastructure and not trying to influence the political scene. And I think that was very consistent in China. And that's a mistake the Europeans have done. It's not to develop an infrastructure in those countries.
Kind of coming back to the conflict in Ukraine, you mentioned the security guarantees that the West may be able to give to Ukraine. What are those security guarantees that would be acceptable for the Russian part?
Well, it's very hard to say at this stage, but remember that the proposal that Zelensky made in March 2022 to the Russians, which eventually was abandoned under pressure of UK, France, and Germany. Very often we say Boris Johnson, and it's true that Boris Johnson was a key actor in that, but we tend to forget the role of France and Germany, who were also with UK to pressure Zelensky to withdraw his proposal. And it's very important to remind people that all the three dialogue initiatives that were started since the 24th of February 2022, all the three initiatives, 25th of February 2022, mid-March 2022, and August 2022, were at the initiative of Zelensky. Zelensky asked to have a dialogue. Zelensky was asking for a dialogue with Russia. And on all three occasions, the Europeans stopped that. All the three. In the first one in February, that was the European Union that stepped in and said no. In March or April 2022, early April 2022, it was UK and France and Germany, as we just said. And in August 2022, it was Boris Johnson again, who came especially to Kiev to stop because Zelensky was aiming at a summit with Putin. And in fact, Putin first didn't want, and then he accepted to have this meeting. But that was killed by Boris Johnson again. And later, the European Union said there will be no appeasement. And based on that, Zelensky adopted his decree to forbid any discussion with the Russians. And this was adopted by the Ukrainian National Security Council on the 3rd of September 2022, and it entered into force on the 4th of October 2022, after being signed by Zelensky. Meaning that the Europeans have played a very nasty role in that. But coming back to the security guarantees, the project provided by Zelensky in March 2022 had an outline of a possible security guarantee structure or architecture based on, I don't remember exactly now the number, whether it was 10 or 15 countries that were selected, among which Russia, by the way. And Zelensky proposed also Russia as a guarantor. So all these guarantors were in fact those who were ready to provide support to Ukraine in the case Ukraine was attacked or was in crisis or things like that. And the Russians accepted that. And they were among the guarantors, and that's something that was very clear for the Russians. So I can assume that a similar solution would be acceptable to the Russians. Now, when we come to the security guarantees, because I've heard different things, and interestingly enough, the communique that was issued last week by all these European leaders, namely those who are today with Zelensky in Washington, D.C., this communique or statement includes the problem of the Budapest memorandum of December 1994. And this memorandum was recalled by Zelensky in a tweet. He made a tweet yesterday on Sunday where he mentions this this memorandum. And I have heard a lot of different things on that. This memorandum is called, I don't know if I have the exact title here. I have to, anyway, if I don't have it, it's not a big problem. But in essence, it's a memorandum on the security assurances to Ukraine. So it mentions security guarantees in the form of, in French, it's garantie de sécurité. In English, it's security assurances. And the idea was at that time in 1994 to create an incentive for the Ukrainians to return the weapons they had, the nuclear weapons the Ukrainians had on their territory, but didn't belong to Ukraine. It was Russian weapons. And the Ukrainians had no capacity, nor the know-how or maintenance capacity or whatever, to use those nuclear weapons. But nevertheless, apparently, for some reason, the Ukrainians felt that having those weapons on their territory was somehow a guarantee for security. And therefore, they asked in exchange of returning those weapons to Russia, that some security guarantees was offered to ensure the integrity of Ukrainian territory. So that's the memorandum. Now, it's very important to realize that a memorandum is not a treaty. It's simply a memorandum. That means that basically it's a political declaration of intent. It's a political document. It's politically binding, but it's not legally binding. Very important to understand that. And that, by the way, was stated in February 2022 by the German ambassador in Kiev, who was interviewed by the Ukrainian TV. And because you may remember that in February 2022, at the Munich Security Conference, Zelensky asked to have nuclear weapons. Now, why did he want those these nuclear weapons? It's not for having nuclear weapons, but in his mind, with the Budapest memorandum, he traded nuclear weapons against a security of an insurance or assurance on the integrity of the Ukrainian territory. And that's why, because the integrity of Ukrainian territory was threatened in February 2022, he said, well, if you cannot provide territorial integrity, then provide me nuclear weapons. That's why he come to the nuclear weapons. You understand that? So the issue was less the nuclear weapons than the territorial integrity. Now, the interesting thing is that in 1994, as I said, this memorandum was only politically binding. And the consequence of that is that it should have been a document that would be legally binding in order to validate what had been said in the memorandum. And this document came in May 1997 in the form of a friendship and assistance treaty between Russia and Ukraine. And in that document, Russia guarantees the integrity of the Ukrainian territory. Now, in this document, if you look Article 4 and Article 6, you will see that there are some conditions also, because it's not just that Russia guarantees the integrity of the Ukrainian territory just for that. There were also some trade-off there. And the trade-off was that Ukraine, in turn, was committed to respect the rights of the minorities and ensure that the minorities in Ukraine had all the rights that are granted to every single citizen, the equality among everybody, regardless of the ethnicity. And then you start to see the problem here. What happened later? First of all, something that nobody said, and this this treaty, which is legally binding on Russia guaranteeing the territorial integrity of Ukraine, nobody mentions it. We mentioned the one which is not binding, but we never mentioned the one who is binding. Why that? Because in May 2019, during the election process of the new president, that led to the election of Volodymyr Zelensky, Petro Poroshenko, in order to create a problem for Zelensky, convinced the Rada not to extend the treaty that was expiring in May 2019, and Poroshenko asked the parliament not to extend the treaty, meaning that in what happened in May 2019, the Ukrainian Rada scrapped the only document that provided a legally binding commitment of Russia to guarantee the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And in 2022, what happened, and that was the reason why you have what happened in Crimea. You may remember that in Crimea, the Crimea was autonomous from Ukraine from January 2021. That means before Ukraine became independent, Crimea was under the rule of Moscow and no longer under the rule of Kiev. In fact, Kiev annexed Crimea in 1994, between 1994 and 1995. The thing is that based on the referendum that happened in January 1991, in 2014, as the Crimea was questioning the issue of the language, because then Russian was no longer an official language.
You mean in the aftermath of the coup in 2014?
Yes, correct. In February just after the coup, because the first decision by the new authorities of 2014, just the Maidan authorities, the first decision was to abolish the status of the Russian language. Until that, the Russian language and Ukrainian language were both official languages in Ukraine. But the first decision was to degrade the level of the status of the Russian language. And Russian language was not abolished, as people say. It's not true, but it was no longer an official language, and it was banned from official use. That's the point. And therefore, that created a lot of reaction to the whole southern part of Ukraine, not just the Donbass, but in the whole Novorossiya, in Odessa and all that. And I was in Odessa at that time, and I could tell you that the situation was extremely tense at this stage, because it was demonstrations all over the south of the country. In any case, we were in 2014, so the friendship treaty had not been abolished so far, because it was abolished in 2019, as I said before. Meaning that the authorities of Crimea said, I mean, the local parliament of Crimea said, well, in fact, Ukraine doesn't respect the Treaty of 1997 because they should protect the right of the minorities. So we decide to make a new referendum, the same that we did in January 1991, and we'll see what the result will be. And based on that referendum, we'll ask to join the Russian Federation. And in essence, what happens, and the whole process that led, there were no troops sent in Ukraine. I still send people that Russia sent troops, and totally wrong. There were not troops coming from outside of the peninsula in Crimea. You had already troops stationed there, based on the status of force agreement signed between Ukraine and Russia, and you had about 22 Russian soldiers stationed officially but you had no additional troops brought in order to annex the Crimea. This is wrong. The whole process was based on the fact that the new authorities, the new Ukrainian authorities, were not respecting the Friendship Treaty of 1997. And that was the legal rationale to have a new referendum and to ask for joining the Russian Federation. That's why today, when people talk about returning Crimea or whatever, this is out of the question. Because all that happened because the Ukrainian authorities didn't implement or comply with the Friendship Treaty of 1997. Later in 2019, this Friendship Treaty was scrapped by the Ukrainians, meaning that, in fact, you cannot even say that Russia breached the treaty by intervening in Ukraine, because Ukraine had scrapped it before. In addition to the fact that, as I explained on your channel, I think a couple of times, the rationale for entering Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022 was not because of NATO. It was in order to protect the population of Donbass, which is a principle of the United Nations, the so-called R2P, responsibility to protect. And that is a principle that is explained. If you read my books, I described all this process in detail, and you have all the explanation based on UN definitions and all that. And that's why Russia could intervene in Ukraine based on Article 51 of the UN Charter. So the whole, that's why it's very important to understand exactly what is the content of these treaties. The issue of the Budapest memorandum was definitely about security guarantees, despite the fact that those weapons didn't belong to Ukraine, and even Ukraine, the nuclear weapons could not be used by Ukraine. But in any case, they asked for these security guarantees. But that came in the form of the Friendship Treaty of 1997. So that means that, and as Putin said during the meeting, the press conference that followed the meeting in Alaska, Putin said that we are working, or we will be working on solutions for the security guarantees. I'm sure Russia most probably wants that. The problem is that it cannot be NATO and it cannot be EU because of their kind of aggressive stance and the fact that NATO has never respected its word. This was this issue of the NATO expansion and something like that.
But Carl, you're talking about NATO, but we know, I assume that you're mostly talking about the European leaders. I don't know if any of these European leaders in power know the history and what you've just mentioned. There is no sign of deep understanding of what's going on.
You're absolutely right. I think none of those leaders know what happened, which are historical facts, by the way. And that was recognized. If you read my books, this is all based on even Ukrainian press reports and things like this. You don't need to read Russian literature on that. The Ukrainian explained that absolutely clearly. And this is explained in all the details, all the legal aspects of that. But nobody wants to listen to that because precisely, and that's exactly the problem, instead of basing decision on historical fact, we base the decision on a narrative that we created from scratch. And that's exactly the problem. And this narrative is now crumbling. because now everybody starts to question how it happened and why it didn't work and things like this. And you will see that in a couple of months or maybe years, you will people coming back to exactly what I said. But you notice also that even those who are in favor of Russia, who are against this NATO and things like that, they don't even know all those details, because you really need. And I was I was in NATO at that time, and incidentally, in 2014, Switzerland was the chairing the USCE, and therefore we had a lot of exchanges in Switzerland about all these aspects, and that's how I had to understand the fine mechanical aspects of the fine tuning of all this crisis. And I digged into all the treaties and all that. I read them in detail, and I tried to make sense of the logic, because when you talk about Russia, it may not apply to countries like France or even United States, because they tend to adjust the legality to what they do. You see, they adjust the facts to what they want. The Russians are not like this. They tend to take the facts first and then to adjust what can be done around that. But they are extremely legalistic in their approach. And I have explained already the whole mechanics of what happened between the 21st of February 2022 and the 24th of February, in those 3 days, where Russia changed its mind about recognizing the independence of the Donbas republics and managed to create a context that would allow to apply the Article 51 of the UN Charter. But it's interesting to see all the efforts that were made to have a legal framework for this intervention. That's something, for instance, when the French sent their troops to Syria, for instance, they didn't make any framework. They just decided to go, period. The same as the US when they decided to attack Iraq. They didn't even think about creating a solid legal framework. They just went and did, period. And that's the difference with the Russians. The Russians are extremely legalistic, and they will adjust. So today, when we say and in fact, I mentioned this statement of those European leaders regarding the summit in Alaska. And the memorandum of Budapest is mentioned in the statement because they say, well, Russia didn't respect that memorandum. But if you study that, you would see that this memorandum had absolutely no legal value at all. And that was even recognized on the website of the State Department at that time. When they described the whole Budapest memorandum in the US State Department, they said that this has no legal value. It's just a political statement, period. So when today those leaders say that Russia didn't respect its own commitments, it's a lie. Russia is very, very legalistic, extremely. It has always been, even during the Cold War, by the way. It's part of this the Russian culture to be extremely legalistic. And that's the interesting thing, because knowing that means that we know that they will stick to the treaties exactly as they were written. You know, they will interpret exactly as it by the word. maybe they go, maybe not further or beyond of it. They will take the word exactly as it is. That's where, when you craft a treaty or an agreement with the Russians, you have to be very, very careful. They will use exactly the wording. They will not go besides this. So, I mean, if you understand that, it makes easier to have an agreement with them, even when it comes to the security guarantees of Ukraine. And I think that's something which is ignored by most people, because we are caught in this rhetoric that the Russians are bad guys. They are, they have all the weaknesses of the world, all the sins of the world, and all that. As a result, how can you even try to build some trust with them? Because anyway, they will cheat you, they will cheat, they will lie, they will. That's how, what we have heard in the last, even more than 3 years, in fact, in the last 10 years, because all the issues I monitored, for instance, we talked about the Russian intervention or invasion even of Ukraine in 1914. And even it's interesting, because I remember I was in NATO, as I told you, at that time, and people were talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in fact, we had absolutely not a single fact that would support the idea of invasion. But people were using this word. And I remember having received an email that said, well, we should not use, that came, I worked in the political division of the NATO. And there is a security policy division in NATO, and I was working in that part, in the arms control part of the NATO. In any case, we received an email saying we should avoid to use the word invasion. We should prefer the word intervention. Because intervention, obviously, is broader and can be political intervention. There are different ways to interpret the word, while invasion is a military thing. So even in NATO, they recognize that, no, we shouldn't use the word invasion because it's wrong. And that's wrong about Donbass, and that's wrong about Crimea. There was no Russian troops. I mean, in Crimea, as I said, there were a certain amount of troops based on the SOFA, this Status of Force Agreement. So that's one thing. But in the Donbass, you had no Russian troops in Donbass. I said it another time, there were no Russian troops in Donbass. There were individual soldiers there. We know that. And even the Ukrainian chief of staff and the head of the SBU, the security service, in two different instances, they said that they had not identified any Russian unit in the Donbass, but they have identified individual soldiers. And that's something which is absolutely clear. There were individual soldiers, so people coming, as you have French soldiers fighting in Ukraine. I'm not talking about those who are on a mission there, but I'm talking about those who have decided to, because they wanted to fight for Crimea, for Ukraine, so they went on their own initiative to help, as you can call them mercenaries, freedom fighters, as you want, but they were individual soldiers. And you had exactly the same thing on the Russian side. So they were just soldiers or people, ex-soldiers, who decided they would go to fight against the Ukraine or to help the Donbass Russians. But there were no Russian units deployed in the Donbass in 2014. None. And that's very important to understand, because this misunderstanding led to the European, especially Ursula von der Leyen. She made statements already in 2020 and 2021, sorry. But when she said that the Ukraine was not supposed to abide by the Minsk agreement because precisely of the Russian presence. And a lot of people still understand or think that the Minsk agreement was an agreement between Ukraine and Russia. This is wrong. The Minsk agreements 1 and 2 were agreements between Kiev, the authorities in Kiev, and the authorities of the two Donbass republics. Period.
Donetsk and Lugansk. Yeah.
Donetsk and Lugansk, exactly. Period. And the Russians were the guarantors for the Donbass Republic so that they implement the agreement. As on the Kiev side, you had France and Germany. They were the guarantors for the application of the agreements on the Ukrainian side. And we have seen that the French and the Germans have not respected their word and said that they never intended to have those agreements implemented, while on the other hand, the Russians made every effort to have the Minsk agreement to be implemented. Up to the last minute, they tried to have an agreement based, because the whole, again, you understand that if you understand that Russia intervened on the 24th of February 2022 in order to protect the population of the Donbass. And the Minsk agreement was about having a solution, some kind of autonomy for the language, religion, and all that for the population of Donbass. So the whole issue was, in fact, a domestic issue. It was not an international issue whatsoever. And the Russians were simply the guarantors for the Donbass republics, meaning that Kiev not implementing the agreement prompted in fact, and even tried to attack the Donbass Republic, prompted the Russian reaction, as I explained before. So it's very important to understand, because as you can understand from everything I mentioned here, everything is linked. We tend to see all these events like separate things. But in reality, in the mind of the Russians, there is a logical tie between all these events. It's a logical relationship between everything that happened. We see that with the when we mentioned the security guarantees and memorandum of Budapest and things like that. There's a logical relationship between all that, and that's, again, by understanding that, we can then craft a possible solution. If we don't understand that, then we'll continue to fight. And that's exactly what the Europeans want today.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Carl, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
That was my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.